You could watch the footage once and think it was just another overseas visit. But look closer, and a very different story begins to emerge. One that some critics believe wasn't about Australia at all, but about something much bigger waiting back in the UK. Because what if this entire tour wasn't the destination, but the rehearsal? The moment Prince Harry and Meghan Markle landed in Australia, the optics felt instantly familiar. The carefully timed walkabouts, the hospital visits, the emotionally charged interactions with vulnerable communities. It all mirrored a structure that audiences have seen for decades from the royal institution itself. And that's exactly where the first question begins to form in people's minds. If they stepped away from royal duties, why does this look so much like a royal tour? Think about it carefully. This wasn't a loose itinerary or a casual appearance. Over just a few days, the couple moved across major cities, from Sydney to Melbourne, executing a tightly scheduled sequence of engagements that maximized visibility at every stop. Hospitals, women's shelters, mental health events, public-facing appearances, each one selected with precision. Each one designed to generate a specific type of image, a specific emotional response, and most importantly, a specific narrative. So here's something to think about. Was this simply charity work? Or was it a performance designed to feel like something more official? Because critics are not just reacting to what happened, they are reacting to how it happened. The presence of UK-based media on the ground raised immediate eyebrows. A reporter. A photographer. Not local coverage picked up organically, but flown-in personnel, documenting every angle, every handshake, every carefully framed moment. That detail alone changes the entire interpretation. Because when you control the lens, you begin to shape the story. And that leads to a deeper question. Who exactly was this tour meant for? Was it for the communities they visited? Or for the global audience watching those images circulate online? Now here's where the narrative takes a sharper turn. Back in 2020, the idea of a half-in, half-out royal role was firmly rejected. The message from the palace was clear. You are either a working royal or you are not. There is no middle ground. No hybrid model. No selective participation. But what critics are now pointing out is something uncomfortable. What if that line is quietly being tested again? Because what we are seeing today doesn't resemble the couple's early post-royal phase. Back then, it was about stepping away, building independence, creating distance. Now, suddenly, it's global appearances, structured engagements, controlled media visibility, all echoing the same system they once left behind. So ask yourself this: does this look like distance? Or does it look like a gradual return? And the timing makes it even more interesting. With the upcoming Invictus Games scheduled in Birmingham, Prince Harry is expected to reappear in the UK spotlight in a very visible way. That event is not just symbolic, it carries global attention, media coverage, and institutional weight. And when you place the Australia tour right before that moment, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like sequence. Australia, then the UK. Visibility, then proximity. Relevance, then presence. So here's the question that's now circulating among commentators. Was this entire tour a setup for something bigger? Because some believe this wasn't just about rebuilding visibility globally, but about re-entering the British narrative without formally rejoining the institution. Not as traditional working royals, but as something new, a parallel presence operating alongside the monarchy, not within it. And that idea is where the real tension begins. On one hand, the couple continues to emphasize independence, personal projects, and freedom from royal constraints. On the other hand, moments like this tour lean heavily on royal symbolism, royal structure, and royal-style storytelling. That contradiction hasn't gone unnoticed. In fact, it's becoming the core of the debate. Are they truly separate from the institution? Or are they redefining what connection to it looks like? And this is where things become even more strategic. Because in today's media landscape, attention itself is power. Visibility is currency. And narrative is everything. Whether this was a charitable mission, a branding exercise, or something in between, one thing is undeniable: the world was watching. Headlines were generated. Images were shared. Conversations were sparked. And sometimes, that alone is the objective. But if this really was a rehearsal, as some critics suggest, then the next phase becomes impossible to ignore. Because what happens when the stage shifts from Australia to the United Kingdom? What happens when the same structure, the same optics, the same carefully controlled narrative appears closer to the heart of the monarchy itself? And more importantly, do you think this was just a one-time tour, or the beginning of a much bigger strategy unfolding right in front of us? Because in the next part, we're going to break down the exact patterns, decisions, and behind-the-scenes details that make this theory far more than just speculation, and far harder to dismiss. Because once you move past the surface-level headlines, the real story isn't just what Prince Harry and Meghan Markle did in Australia, it's how precisely everything was structured. And this is where the narrative starts to feel less like a trip, and more like a blueprint. Start with the schedule itself. Over a compressed window of just a few days, the couple moved strategically between Sydney, Melbourne, and other key locations, hitting multiple high-visibility engagements with almost no downtime. That kind of pacing is not accidental. It mirrors the exact formula used in official royal tours, where the goal is simple: maximize exposure, dominate headlines, and create a continuous stream of visual moments that keep global attention locked in. So let me ask you something. Does that sound like a relaxed visit, or a carefully engineered media cycle? Because the choice of locations tells an even deeper story. One of the central stops was a children's hospital. Now think about that for a second. Hospital visits have always been one of the most powerful tools in royal engagements, because they create emotional connection instantly. Images of compassion, closeness, human vulnerability. These are the moments that travel the fastest across media platforms. And during this visit, the visuals were exactly what you would expect. Close interactions, soft expressions, carefully framed shots that communicate empathy without needing a single word. But here's the uncomfortable question critics are asking. Were those moments purely about service, or were they also about optics? Because the pattern didn't stop there. The couple also visited a women's refuge, another highly symbolic environment often used in traditional royal tours. Again, the visuals were consistent. Serving food, speaking with residents, engaging directly with individuals in vulnerable situations. These are not random selections. These are categories that have historically defined how the monarchy presents itself: healthcare, community support, emotional outreach. And when you stack these appearances together, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. So here's something I want you to think about. If you removed the names from this tour and just looked at the structure, would you assume this was a private visit, or an official royal engagement? Because critics argue the answer is obvious. Now let's go one layer deeper. It's not just where they went, it's how those moments were captured. Unlike a typical private trip, this tour included UK-based media flown in specifically to document everything. A reporter. A photographer. Not random coverage, not independent journalism, but controlled access. And that detail matters more than most people realize, because when you control the images, you control the narrative that gets distributed globally. Every handshake, every smile, every interaction becomes part of a carefully curated story. So ask yourself, who benefits most from that level of control? Because once those images are released, they don't just show what happened. They shape how people interpret what happened. And that's where the strategy begins to reveal itself. Now here's where things get even more complex. Reports suggest that alongside these charitable appearances, Meghan Markle was also involved in discussions connected to her personal business ventures. Potential partnerships. Brand-related conversations. And that introduces a controversial overlap, because traditionally, royal engagements and commercial interests are kept completely separate. But here, the lines appear blurred. So let me ask you directly, can a visit be both charitable and commercial at the same time, without changing how people perceive it? Because for critics, this is one of the biggest red flags of the entire tour. And then comes the timing. Nothing in this sequence exists in isolation. With the upcoming Invictus Games set to take place in Birmingham, Prince Harry is preparing to step back into a highly visible UK environment. That event carries international weight, strong emotional backing, and deep personal connection to his public identity. Now place that fact next to the Australia tour. A high-visibility, structured, globally covered trip, followed by a major UK appearance. And suddenly, it starts to feel like a sequence rather than coincidence. So here's the question that's making people pause. Was Australia the build-up? And is the UK the real stage? Because critics believe this is where the strategy becomes impossible to ignore. Australia creates momentum. It rebuilds visibility. It reintroduces familiar royal-style imagery to global audiences. And then, just as that attention peaks, the narrative shifts toward the UK, where the stakes are significantly higher. That is not random timing. That is narrative sequencing. And once you see it that way, everything starts to connect. But there's another layer that makes this even more fascinating. Public reaction. Footage from across Australia showed mixed responses. Some crowds were enthusiastic, taking photos, engaging openly. Others appeared more reserved, watching from a distance. And that contrast matters, because while visibility was achieved, opinion wasn't necessarily transformed. So let me ask you something important. Does visibility alone equal success, if it doesn't change how people feel? Because in the long run, perception is everything. And critics argue that increased exposure can actually amplify scrutiny rather than reduce it. The more polished and structured these appearances become, the more they invite direct comparison with official royal tours. And once that comparison starts, it becomes very difficult to control how the public judges those similarities. Are they equivalent? Or are they imitation? Are they independent? Or are they still connected? And that brings us to the core tension driving this entire story. Because what we're witnessing isn't just a tour. It's a redefinition attempt. A new model where independence and royal identity are not separated, but blended. Where public service, media visibility, and personal branding operate in the same space. And where the boundaries that once felt clear, now feel increasingly blurred. And just when you think you've understood the structure, the details begin to expose something even more deliberate. Because what truly caught critics' attention wasn't just the schedule or the locations, it was the pattern hidden inside the smallest decisions. The kind of decisions most viewers would scroll past, but once you notice them, you cannot unsee them. Take the visual storytelling. Throughout the Australia visit, nearly every major appearance by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle followed a remarkably consistent format. Close physical proximity, emotionally charged environments, carefully timed interactions, and most importantly, perfectly framed images released almost instantly across global platforms. These were not random snapshots. They were high-quality, narrative-driven visuals designed to communicate something very specific: connection, compassion, and authority. Now here's the question. When every image tells the same story so precisely, is that coincidence or coordination? Because critics argue that consistency at this level requires planning, not spontaneity. And then there's the choice of symbolism. During the hospital visits, for example, the imagery echoed something deeply familiar to royal watchers. The positioning, the body language, even the emotional tone felt reminiscent of historic royal moments that have defined public perception for decades. That comparison alone has fueled intense discussion online. So let me ask you this. Do you think audiences respond to these moments because they are genuine, or because they feel familiar? Because familiarity is powerful. It creates instant recognition, instant emotional trust. And when used strategically, it can recreate the impact of something much larger than the moment itself. Now let's go deeper. Another detail that critics have been focusing on is the level of coordination behind each appearance. Footage shows controlled environments, structured crowd placement, clear pathways, and optimal camera angles at almost every stop. This is not how spontaneous visits typically unfold. This is how high-level events are executed when multiple teams are working behind the scenes to ensure everything runs exactly as planned. So here's something to think about. If this was just a private visit, why does it require the same level of organization as an official state tour? Because coordination like this doesn't happen by accident. It requires collaboration between event organizers, local authorities, and media teams. It requires timing, communication, and most importantly, intention. And that word, intention, is where the entire debate begins to intensify. Because once you start analyzing intention, the conversation shifts from what happened to why it happened. Now consider this. During multiple appearances, both Prince Harry and Meghan Markle reinforced themes that have been central to their public identity for years. mental health, resilience, media pressure, personal struggle. These are not new talking points. They are part of a long-established narrative that has been repeated across interviews, documentaries, and public speeches. And here, in Australia, that same narrative reappears again, seamlessly integrated into each engagement. So ask yourself, why repeat the same message across different platforms and different countries? Because repetition builds identity. It reinforces perception. And it ensures that no matter where the audience encounters them, the story remains consistent. But here's where things become even more strategic. Because alongside that emotional narrative, there is another layer operating quietly in the background: relevance. In today's media ecosystem, staying relevant is not optional. It is essential. And relevance is not maintained through silence. It is maintained through visibility. Appear, engage, create moments, dominate coverage, and most importantly, stay part of the conversation. And that's exactly what this tour achieved. So here's the critical question. Was the goal to serve, or to stay visible? Because those two objectives can exist together, but they don't always carry the same weight. Now let's connect this to something even bigger. The timing of this tour, just ahead of the Invictus Games in Birmingham, is not just significant. It may be the key to understanding the entire strategy. Because when Prince Harry steps into that UK spotlight, he won't be arriving as someone who has been out of view. He will arrive with momentum, visibility, and a freshly reinforced public image shaped by everything that happened in Australia. That changes perception before he even lands. So let me ask you something important. Do first impressions matter more, or recent impressions? Because in this case, the most recent impression has already been carefully constructed. And that's what makes this sequence so powerful. Australia wasn't just exposure, it was preparation. Preparation for a moment where global attention shifts back toward the UK, where every appearance will be analyzed, compared, and interpreted within the context of the monarchy itself. And that brings us to the most controversial idea of all. Some critics believe this isn't just about rebuilding presence, but about redefining position. Not returning as traditional working royals, but establishing a new kind of role. A role that operates outside the institution, yet still draws from its influence. A role that allows independence while maintaining the visibility, recognition, and symbolic weight associated with royalty. And that idea challenges everything the monarchy has historically stood for. So here's the question that divides opinion. Can you step away from an institution and still operate within its image? Because if the answer is yes, then what we are witnessing is not just a tour. It's a transformation. A shift in how royal identity can exist in the modern world. But if the answer is no, then what critics are seeing becomes far more controversial. It becomes imitation without accountability. It becomes influence without structure. And it raises questions that the institution itself cannot easily ignore. Now pause for a second and think about this. If this model succeeds, what stops it from becoming the new normal? Because that possibility is exactly what makes this situation so closely watched. And as the narrative moves closer to the UK, where tradition, protocol, and public expectation carry even greater weight, the stakes are about to rise dramatically. Because in the next part, we're not just looking at patterns anymore. We're going to examine the reactions, the pressure building behind the scenes, and why some believe this strategy could either redefine their future or completely backfire in ways no one is expecting. So here's the big question I want you to think about before we move forward. Are Prince Harry and Meghan Markle creating something new, or trying to recreate something they were never allowed to keep? Because in the next part, we're going even deeper. We're going to break down the specific moments, hidden signals, and subtle decisions that critics believe expose the real intention behind this tour, and why some are calling it not just strategic, but a direct challenge to the monarchy itself. And just when the strategy starts to look convincing, the pressure begins to build from every direction. Because what happened after the Australia tour wasn't quiet admiration, it was intense scrutiny, growing criticism, and a wave of questions that refused to go away. The same visibility that elevated Prince Harry and Meghan Markle also exposed them to something far more dangerous: direct comparison with the institution they once left behind. And that comparison is where everything starts to get complicated. Across media panels, online discussions, and public commentary, a recurring theme began to emerge. People weren't just asking what the couple was doing. They were asking how it compared to official royal standards. The structure, the optics, the messaging, everything was being measured against the monarchy itself. So let me ask you something. When you operate in a space that looks identical to the system you exited, can you really avoid being judged by its rules? Because that's exactly what is happening now. Critics argue that the Australia tour didn't just recreate royal-style engagements. It invited royal-level expectations. Expectations around accountability, transparency, and purpose. And once those expectations are triggered, the conversation shifts dramatically. It is no longer about independent activity. It becomes about legitimacy. Now here's where the pressure intensifies. One of the most debated issues coming out of the tour is the perceived contradiction between messaging and behavior. Over the past few years, both Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have spoken openly about wanting privacy, stepping away from media intrusion, and distancing themselves from the pressures of royal life. Those statements became a defining part of their narrative. But then comes a tour like this, highly visible, globally covered, carefully documented at every stage. So here's the uncomfortable question people are asking. Can you claim to seek privacy while simultaneously operating at one of the highest levels of public exposure? Because that tension is difficult to ignore. And for many observers, it creates a disconnect that becomes harder to reconcile with each new appearance. Now let's take this even further. Another point of criticism centers around the blending of roles. During the tour, there were clear overlaps between charitable engagements and potential commercial interests. While details remain limited, even the perception of this overlap has sparked debate, because traditionally, the monarchy has maintained a strict boundary between service and personal gain. But here, that boundary appears less defined. So ask yourself, does mixing charity with branding strengthen the message, or weaken its credibility? Because perception, once again, becomes everything. And this is where the narrative starts to split. On one side, supporters argue that modern public figures should be allowed to evolve, to combine influence with entrepreneurship, and to operate in ways that reflect today's global media landscape. They see this as adaptation, not contradiction. On the other side, critics see something very different. They see a model that borrows heavily from royal prestige while sidestepping royal responsibility. A model that uses familiar structures without accepting the limitations that come with them. And that's where the phrase parallel monarchy begins to surface more frequently in discussions. So let me ask you directly, do you think it's possible to build influence outside the institution while still relying on its legacy? Because that question is at the heart of this entire controversy. Now let's talk about impact. Despite the massive visibility generated by the Australia tour, early reactions suggest that public opinion hasn't shifted as dramatically as one might expect. In some places, crowds were engaged and enthusiastic. In others, the response felt more restrained, more observational than supportive. And that contrast matters more than it seems. Because visibility without persuasion creates a very specific outcome. It keeps you in the conversation, but it doesn't necessarily change how that conversation feels. So here's something to think about. If people are watching, but not changing their minds, is the strategy really working? Because in the long term, perception is not built on presence alone. It is built on trust, consistency, and clarity. And right now, critics argue that clarity is exactly what's missing. Now bring this back to timing. With the Invictus Games in Birmingham approaching, the focus is about to shift from international audiences back to the UK public. And that shift changes everything, because the UK is not just another stage. It is the center of the monarchy's identity, tradition, and public accountability. What might feel acceptable globally can be interpreted very differently at home. So here's the key question. Will the same strategy that worked in Australia hold up under UK scrutiny? Because the expectations are higher. The comparisons are sharper. And the emotional connection to the institution runs far deeper. And that is where the real test begins. Because if this truly is a carefully planned re-entry into the royal conversation, then the UK phase is not just another chapter. It is the moment where everything either aligns or unravels. Now pause for a second and consider this. If the Australia tour was about rebuilding visibility, and the UK appearance is about testing acceptance, then what comes next if that test succeeds? Does this evolve into a permanent model? A new way of operating that blends independence with royal identity? Or does it trigger a stronger response from the institution itself, forcing clearer boundaries to be drawn once again? Because one thing is becoming impossible to ignore. This is no longer just about a tour. It is about influence, positioning, and the future shape of public royal identity in a world where media, branding, and personal narratives move faster than tradition can keep up. And in the final part, we're going to bring everything together. Because the biggest question isn't what they've done so far. It's what happens next, and whether this entire strategy leads to a breakthrough moment, or a backlash that changes everything. And now we arrive at the moment where everything connects. Because what looked like a tour, what felt like a sequence of appearances, what sparked debate across continents, may ultimately be judged by one single outcome: what happens next. Because if the Australia visit was the rehearsal, then the real performance is about to unfold under far more intense scrutiny. And this time, the stage is not thousands of miles away. It is much closer to the heart of the institution itself. As Prince Harry prepares for the next phase surrounding the Invictus Games in Birmingham, the conversation is no longer speculative. It is focused, sharpened, and watching for confirmation. Because everything we have seen so far begins to point toward one critical question. Was this all leading here? Think about the sequence again. Australia created visibility. It reintroduced familiar royal-style imagery into the global narrative. It re-established presence, reinforced identity, and most importantly, it reminded audiences exactly who Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are within that wider royal context. But here's the part that matters most. Visibility only sets the stage. It does not decide the outcome. So let me ask you something. What truly determines success in a strategy like this? Attention or acceptance? Because as the focus shifts toward the UK, acceptance becomes the real test. And this is where the stakes reach an entirely different level. The United Kingdom is not just another audience. It is deeply connected to the monarchy's identity, history, and public expectation. Every appearance, every gesture, every interaction will be interpreted through a far more critical lens. Comparisons will not just happen, they will intensify. So here's the question that's quietly building. When the same strategy is placed directly beside the institution it mirrors, will it feel convincing or conflicting? Because that answer could define everything that follows. Now consider the possibilities. If the upcoming appearances in the UK are received positively, if the optics align, if public sentiment begins to shift even slightly, then what we are witnessing could evolve into something much larger than a single tour. It could become a working model, a new way of operating where independence and royal association exist side by side, not as contradictions, but as a hybrid identity. And if that happens, it changes the entire conversation. It challenges the traditional boundaries that once seemed fixed. It introduces a new dynamic where influence is no longer tied strictly to official roles, but can exist through perception, visibility, and narrative control. So ask yourself this: are we watching the creation of a new kind of royal presence? One that operates outside the institution, yet still shapes how it is perceived? Because if the answer is yes, then this moment is far bigger than it appears. But there is another side to this. Because if the UK response is more critical, more resistant, or simply unchanged despite the increased visibility, then the entire strategy begins to face a different reality. A reality where attention does not translate into acceptance. Where repetition does not reshape perception. And where the gap between independence and royal identity becomes too wide to bridge. And that leads to a very different outcome. Instead of redefining their position, it reinforces the boundaries that were set years ago. It strengthens the idea that you cannot operate within royal symbolism without being part of the royal structure. So here's the question you need to consider. What happens if this strategy doesn't land the way it was intended? Because in that scenario, the same visibility that was meant to build momentum could begin to amplify criticism instead. And once that shift happens, controlling the narrative becomes much harder. Now pause for a moment and think about everything we've uncovered. The structured itinerary. The carefully selected locations. The controlled media presence. The consistent messaging. The precise timing leading into a major UK event. None of these elements exist in isolation. Together, they form a pattern. And that pattern is why this story has captured so much attention. Because it forces a bigger conversation. one that goes beyond a single tour or a single couple. It raises questions about how influence works in the modern world. Can legacy be leveraged without responsibility? Can visibility replace official authority? Can narrative shape reality more than structure itself? And perhaps the most important question of all, are we witnessing evolution or imitation? Because depending on how you answer that, the entire story changes. Now as we move forward, one thing is absolutely certain. This isn't over. The next appearance, the next event, the next moment in the spotlight will not just be another headline. It will be part of a larger narrative that is still unfolding, still being shaped, and still being debated in real time. And that's why every detail matters. Every decision, every image, every reaction. Because in a world driven by attention, the smallest moment can carry the biggest meaning. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think this Australia tour was just a series of appearances? Or do you believe it was a calculated step toward something much bigger waiting in the UK? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this debate is only getting more intense, and your perspective is part of the story too. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to like the video. It really helps push this content to more people who want to understand what's happening beneath the headlines. And if you want more deep, high-retention analysis like this every single day, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this story is already unfolding, and you won't want to miss it.